In his second term as president, Jefferson directed the construction of his unique personal retreat at Poplar Forest, his westernmost farm in Bedford County. The house began to take shape as bricklayer Hugh Chisholm and his crew added course after course of brick on the octagonal foundation. Jefferson's plan brought together architecture and landscape into an environment where he could find rest and leisure and rekindle creativity. He also continued the operation of Poplar Forest as a working plantation, critical to his efforts as a farmer. Today, under the guidance of the Corporation for Jefferson's Poplar Forest, the house and plantation are undergoing state-of-the-art restoration, reconstruction, and archaeological investigation. Poplar Forest is considered by scholars to be the culmination of Jefferson's mature skills as an architect, while archaeology is uncovering more clues about Jefferson's landscape design, his farming operation, and the people who made up Poplar Forest plantation community. Poplar Forest has earned an honor award from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, is a National Historic Landmark, a Virginia Historic Landmark, and has been added to the United States nomination list to become a World Heritage Site. The site is open April through November from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. daily, except Tuesdays and Thanksgiving Day. Seven years his junior and still a student of law in Williamsburg, Thomas Jefferson witnessed Patrick Henry's defiant stand in opposition to Great Britain's Stamp Act during the May 1765 session in the House of Burgesses. Jefferson later wrote that he
heard the splendid display of Mr. Henry's talents as a popular orator. Oh, they were great indeed, such as I have never heard from any other man. He appeared to me to speak as Homer wrote.
Both men championed the colonists' rights as English citizens. Henry vocally in fiery and passionate language, and Jefferson on paper, writing with elegance, succinctness, and essence. Both served in public office, Henry 30 years and Jefferson 40 years. They held the office of Governor of Virginia, were elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, served as delegates to the Continental Congress, and each were national symbols of the American fight for liberty against British tyranny. They began as friends and close collaborators together, drafting the Proclamation for a Day of Fasting, Humiliation, and Prayer in 1774, and drawing together a consensus of their fellow Burgesses. After the beginning of the War for Independence, Jefferson and Henry began to differ in opinions relative to a central government versus states' rights, relationships between church and state, and what generally became known as the conflict in Federalist versus Anti-Federalist politics. Fifth grade students from Brookneal Elementary School have taken up the challenge to learn more about these two extraordinary men. The students will inquire into their early life and career as lawyers, how they became acquainted with one another, their reactions to the Stamp Act and the Boston Tea Party, Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, their role as wartime governors, their issues and concerns once independence was won, and what they see as the future of the 13 United States of America.
Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Henry, my classmates and I want to welcome you today and thank you for agreeing to meet with us. As fellow patriots, we are honored that you are here to answer our questions.
Well, thank you, Ken. I'm certainly most honored to have this opportunity to speak with you, Mr. Henry?
And I, very honored. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sierra. Mr. Henry, can you give us some details about your earlier years, your family, and your education?
Yes, my dear. I was born and raised in Hanover County, which is about a 2-day ride by horseback from Williamsburg, our former capital of Virginia. I had not the advantage of my worthy friend to receive a classical education from the College of William and Mary. Rather, I was schooled at home by my father and my uncle. And I will confess to you that in my early years, I was far more fond of hunting and fishing and spending time in the out of doors than I was studying my books. But I have since made up for it. A very happy early life in the backwoods of Virginia.
Hi, my name is Ariana. Mr. Jefferson, will you please share some details about your early years, your family, and your education?
Well, I'd be delighted to, Ariana. I had the good fortune to be born into a family of 10 children. I had 6 sisters and 3 brothers. I was the eldest son, though I had 2 sisters who were older than me. And the good fortune as well that my family could afford to send me to school. So as a young boy, I attended to a classical academy, not only learning how to read and write, but to also speak Latin and Greek. And then the great fortune to go beyond an elementary curriculum of schooling to a college and attend to a collegiate curriculum at the Old Royal College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia.
Hi, my name is Hannah. Mr. Henry and Mr. Jefferson, you both became lawyers. Would you each describe the path you took to get your law degree?
Why, certainly. Miss Hannah, should I begin?
Well, Mr. Henry, I believe you acquired your degree before I did, if we
Yes.
ought to call it a degree.
Well, as you know, Hannah, there are no colleges for the specific purpose of law in Virginia. At least there were not at that time. There has since been a chair of law erected at the College of William and Mary, but long after I'd already become a lawyer. And Mr. Jefferson and I followed different approaches completely to the learning of law with me. Truly out of desperation, for I had attempted 2 times at a country store, both of which failed. My farm burned. For a period of time I was living in my father-in-law's tavern just to have some shelter above my head and that of my family's, 2 small children at the time, when I began to think that I might be well suited to the profession of law. For my mother still claims that I have a gift from God for argument. So I borrowed as many law books as I could lay my hands upon, which was 3. Read them in 6 weeks' time when I made that fateful journey to Williamsburg to stand for my examinations. That was in 1760. And at the risk of appearing perhaps immodest and perhaps bruising the personal nature of my worthy friend, most agree that I'm the best lawyer, not only in Williamsburg City, but in all of America. So if any of you should require any legal advices, I'll be pleased to speak with you after.
I may simply tell you that I had the advantage of reading law as well, but I read law with someone already licensed and well qualified to teach the law. That was George Wythe, who lived in Williamsburg, Virginia. And so I read law with Mr. Wythe for, upwards of about 3 years. Now, that did not mean that I went to school at Mr. Wythe's house every day and he taught law and I would read the books he recommended. Well, he would recommend books, but I would take those books with me back to my farm. And in betwixt chores, well, then I would attend to reading law and then ride back to Williamsburg several times a year, and I would be tested by Mr. Wythe on what I had read. And we would discuss it and speak upon certain elements of English law. Read such English jurists as Sir Edward Coke and William Blackstone, Lord Kames. And then the object was, after you've read the law and felt that you are well equipped to attend to your examination, you had to stand for several hours before 3 gentlemen who would ask you questions continuously about the law. And you had to satisfy them in your answers. So fortunately, I was able then to be licensed to practice the law after I passed that oral examination. Mr. Henry was licensed as well. In fact, I believe that Mr. Wythe was one of your adjudicators,
In order to be a lawyer, you know, Hannah, one must receive 2 signatures upon his law certificate. In my case, it was Mr. John Randolph, or John the Tory, as he became known, and then George Wythe. I shall ever be in profound debt to both of them.
In fact, I heard a tale that Mr. Henry had not satisfied Mr. Wythe completely in his answers, and therefore, when it was time for both Mr. Randolph and Mr. Wythe to decide to provide an adjudication, that is, a comment upon whether Mr. Henry was worthy to practice the law, Mr. Wythe said, "Well, I don't think so yet." Well, Patrick Henry then launched into, speech making. And concerns expressed to Mr. Wythe why he felt he was qualified. Do you know, it is said that Mr. Henry backed Mr. Wythe up to the wall to the extent that Mr. Wythe said, Mr. Henry, I shall sign your license, for your simple argument has convinced me."
That's not the way I remember it. And I'll remind you that I will continue until my dying day to be engaged in the profession of law. My worthy friend, however, gave up the law. And what was it, 1773?
No, Mr. Henry, 74. I practiced for a good 7 years.
But it was shortly after he lost a court case to me.
Hi, Hi, my name is Alex. Mr. Henry, what was your first case?
Well, Mr. Alex, my first case in the law courts was difficult for me to remember because I had so many of them in my early years. I was riding what was known as the county circuit, going from courthouse to courthouse, this in the back country of Virginia. And the greatest amount of my law cases had to do with debt, civil complaints. And so it was, my first case was certainly one where money was claimed to be owed to someone else, and I was representing my client in order to receive those monies. But the first case that brought some considerable renown to my name, in fact, some could say it made me, was a legal cause that I argued in Hanover County in December of 1763. It was known as the Parsons Cause. And in fact, it was so critical a legal cause that since that time, many of the small farmers throughout Virginia began to think of me as their champion. That if there was one man in the capital city of Williamsburg who was going to always be protecting the rights and interests of the small farmer, it's Henry. Because during the course of the Parsons Cause, I was the first man ever to dare to challenge the authority of the king in England to veto or nullify laws that we, the people of Virginia, had made for our own benefit and protection. It was a great victory that day, and that's the court case I remember most.
Hello, my name is Abby. Gentlemen, as lawyers, you both practice before the general court. What type of cases were heard by the general court? Please share with us one of your cases.
Well, I can tell you that the general court, that is the high court, the Supreme Court, in the former colony of Virginia, attended to cases founded in property disputes. It could be real estate, it could be property valued at a certain extent of monies, and also felonies. That is overt murder or high treason. Those causes and arguments would be taken up into the high courts of Virginia. Each county had its own particular county court where there were more or less misdemeanors heard and some property cases, but the great property cases occurred in the general court. Most of my cases were founded upon caveats on land. That is, when someone would seek to purchase land and yet fail after a time to provide the complete monies for that purchase, failed to pay the balance of what monies they had already put down. So someone could then say, I would like to acquire that land, and put out a caveat that if the owner does not pay up on the balance of the property, then I may pay, and the property will be mine. So those cases would be argued in the general court. I would say the one case, though, that I will never forget was the argument over the property of man as a unit of property. I'm speaking, of course, of the unfortunate property in slavery. And I argued the case called Hal versus Netherland. Mr. Netherland had purchased Sam Hal, a slave, from the Church of England. Can you imagine? And Sam Hal felt that he should now be free, that he had not the right to be sold from the church, who should have been his guardian, to someone else. So he ran away. And he was captured and brought back, and Mr. Netherland said, I will not have any more of this. Man, I want my money back. And so that case was brought to the general court in Williamsburg, Virginia, and I defended Sam Hal. I said, yes, he is free in nature, and the church had no right to sell him. Do you know that the gentleman who actually represented Mr. Netherland, the owner of Sam Hal, was Mr. George Wythe, under whom I had read law. We colluded on that case to bring up the fallibility and the inconsistency and contradictions within the laws of slavery. I did lose, I'm afraid. But Hal versus Netherlands stood to be a remarkable case, purporting the foundation that slavery truly is unjust.
And as for me, Miss Abby, perhaps a very curious legal case, not of a civil nature, but that of a criminal nature, was a time when I was defending a man by the name of Henry Bullard. Mr. Bullard had been charged with willful murder, which is one of those crimes for which, if one is convicted, no mercy will be shown. He'll be hanged by his neck until dead within 21 days of the sentence being passed down. And it was a most unpleasant and unfortunate, and what I argued was a tragical incident, where the The young girl, Mary Pinner by name, that he had, caused the death of, I argued to the court that day and to the jury that at the time of that unfortunate incident, that Mr. Bullard was in a temporary moment of impassioned insanity, that the charge of willful murder was far too severe, rather manslaughter should be brought. He was convicted of manslaughter, but he was able to plead the benefit of the clergy. That is to say, he was able to have his life spared. He was burned in the hand with a hot iron, with an M for manslaughter, but lived to return to his family and become a productive member of society. I believe that this is the first time in the annals of legal history that this particular defense has ever been tried.
Hi, my name is Nathan. Mr. Henry, just a few days after being elected to the House of Burgesses, you spoke on the floor pertaining to the Stamp Act. What was this Stamp Act, and what was your objection to it?
A good question, Mr. Nathan. In fact, there are some who believe that my resolutions against the hated Stamp Act began our dispute, our troubles with Great Britain. The Stamp Act was an insidious, diabolical plan by the Parliament in Great Britain to tax these American colonies, though we were not represented within the Parliament, and in effect without our consent. 55 different provisions to the Stamp Act, whereby virtually any piece of paper which would trade hands here in these American colonies would have to have affixed to it a stamp bearing the smiling and sneering likeness of King George III, and these stamps and the stamped paper purchased at outrageous fees, and things so commonplace, affecting every walk of life. Papers certifying that your hogsheads of tobacco had been inspected and certified, papers clearing ships from the docks, newspapers, licenses, wills, deeds, any diplomas from the college, playing cards that you might be better able to educate your children to the mild and benevolent precepts of the gospel of Jesus. All of these things would be stamped. The principle was not the money that would be raised for the British government. The principle was that one of our fundamental rights, the right to tax ourselves with our own consent through our own duly elected representatives, was being threatened. Happily, we were able to force the repeal of the Stamp Act the following year, in 1766, but it was replaced with yet another attempt by the British government to collect revenues here in these American colonies, though they never had the constitutional ability to do so.
Hello, my name is Caitlin. Mr. Jefferson, were you present that day? What was your opinion on Mr. Henry's comments? Please share your views on the Stamp Act.
Well, Miss Caitlin, I certainly was present that day, and I will never forget it. Oh, I was absolutely struck in awe of Mr. Henry's magnificent talent in speech-making, as were many of the burgesses there present. Oh, and when Mr. Henry brought the attention of all of the burgesses to the point where you could hear a pin drop upon the floor of the House of Burgesses, why, I thought indeed we were ready to take up arms and defend our inherent rights, those rights that are given to us not only as Virginians, but those rights that are given to mankind across the globe, not by any government, not by any ruler, those rights given to man by nature and nature's God. Do you know, that evening I confided in my commonplace, a commonplace, of course, being a book in which you write your opinions, write your thoughts, write your observations. Keep it more or less as a journal of your thoughts, that you might remind yourself in the future what you once thought, and keep track of your opinions as you grow older. Well, I wrote, "This day I have heard Patrick Henry speak just as Homer wrote, and he has set a great impetus to the ball of revolution." For me and many others, as you heard Mr. Henry say earlier, I believe the American Revolution did begin at that moment. It was in our minds already, but Mr. Henry expressed what we were thinking.
Hi, my name is Jordan. Gentlemen, I understand that there were cries of treason. What did this mean? What was the penalty for treason?
Oh, well, I remember it vividly, as Mr. Henry, of course, built in his fervor in opposition to the Stamp Act that he brought in references to history. And he made us all realize, well, Mr. Henry, I should not quote while you were sitting here amongst us. Please, sir, if you will, speak what you spoke so boldly and influentially that day.
I was simply offering friendly advice to His Majesty the King, reminding him that he would do well to pay attention to history, reminding him, for example, that Tarquin and Caesar had each his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III...
Treason! That's when all of the Burgesses, let alone Speaker Robinson, who was seated on the chair, shouted out, "Treason, treasonous!" Mr. Henry was now bringing into his argument the King of England himself, accusing him of turning against the people and what might happen if he did so. I remember that Speaker Robinson asked you to apologize. Apologize to your fellow Burgesses, apologize to the King of England, and be seated without further comment. But Mr. Henry, you did apologize, and yet were you seated?
Oh, no, I continued on. I reminded George III that he might profit from their example, and that if this be treason, make the most of it. Yes, and as to and there were cries of treason, as Mr. Jefferson stated. It wasn't the first time for me. You know, I spoke earlier of the Parsons Cause that I argued in 1763. There were cries of treason that day, too. Speaking out in such a bold fashion against the king and the government of Great Britain. No charges of treason were brought, but if they had been, and if I had been convicted of treason, the penalty is death, hanging by the neck within 21 days of the sentence being passed, and no benefit of the clergy. No mercy will be shown for treason.
Remember, Mr. Henry, that when the war began, almost immediately a price was placed upon the head of both Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. If anyone could find us and capture us, they'd be paid a great deal of money to bring us into the British law, thereby to be shackled in chains, brought back to England across the ocean, tried for treason, and you know the consequence if found guilty: hanged.
My head was worth 2,000 pounds, Mr. Jefferson. What was yours worth?
I believe mine was upwards of about 1,500 pounds, Mr. Henry.
Hi, my name is Titus. Mr. Henry, how did you, Mr. Jefferson, and other Virginians respond to the blockading of the Boston harbor by the British following the Boston Tea Party?
Titus, you're speaking of one of the many times that Mr. Jefferson and I worked hand in glove, in close concert one with another, in this struggle for our rights and liberties. When we heard of the closure of Boston's port, which was to take place on the 1st of June, 1774, realizing that though we had always disliked New England men on general principles, but at that time, that closure of the port was an attack upon us in Virginia too. That if it would be such an easy matter for the British Navy to seal off the port of Boston, how little time would it be before they made their way to the Chesapeake Bay here in Virginia? We realized together that we had to show some support and sympathy for our distressed friends in Boston. We also realized that it was time for us to speak as Americans with one collective voice, that it was only that way that we were going to be able to make Great Britain listen to us. And so we gathered very late at night in the Capitol building in Williamsburg City. And there we hatched a scheme which called for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, which we would observe on the day that the port of Boston was to be closed, the 1st of June. We'd begin at the Capitol building at 10 o'clock in the morning, and we would proceed down the main street in Williamsburg, following Mr. Speaker with the mace, on down to Bruton Parish, and there we would fall upon our knees and pray that the Almighty would restore wisdom and good guidance unto His Majesty the King and his wicked and corrupt ministers. We knew that we were putting Lord Dunmore, our royal governor, into a very difficult position. We knew, in fact, that he was only going to have one recourse left to him: dissolving the House of Burgesses, to end government in Virginia, royal government. And that, of course, opened the door to our meeting in a series of conventions, eventually a Congress.
That's correct. The Congress was called from Williamsburg. The first initial call for a Congress bringing together delegates of all of the colonies emanated in Williamsburg.
Hello, my name is Austin. Mr. Jefferson, tell us about Lord Dunmore and his role in Virginia. What was his response to what was being discussed in the House of Burgesses?
Well, I will never forget John Murray, the Earl of Dunmore, simply because he never wanted to be forgotten as a stern and strict ruler governing with an iron hand and thereby suggesting his opinion was sole. No matter what the people of Virginia might suggest, no matter what the representatives might come up with, he still wished to be known as the royal authority, the king's executive there in the colony of Virginia. And you know, he was brought into Virginia from New York. He had been the governor in the colony of New York and was considered to have governed so strongly there that as Virginia seemed to be becoming a turmoil of public opinion, that it would be wise to bring a strong ruler into Virginia and quell that social disturbance. Well, his efforts only provoked us to retaliate. Oh, the more stern and austere he became, the more determined we were that he understand that we have already become a people, determined ourselves to hold on to our British privileges, let alone our natural rights. This just angered him more and more. So you can imagine in time, as Mr. Henry said, dissolving the House of Burgesses, which was his right to do as a royal governor. We would not be so easily dissolved. And we continued to meet, and finally his attempts to deny us our gunpowder was wont to provoke us even more so to retaliate with taking up arms wherever we could find them. Mr. Henry himself forming a militia, marching on to Williamsburg, but by that time Governor Dunmore had sought his escape. He ventured out, did he not, to the York River. There was a ship to greet him there as he took his leave.
There was. And then Lord Dunmore was no longer the royal governor, but rather became a pirate, the likes of which we in Virginia had not seen since Blackbeard, stopping ships, molesting their passengers, carrying off slaves, some of which he was selling in the West Indies to their certain deaths, raiding plantations for provisions, stealing cattle, burning crops, threatening to burn the capital city of Williamsburg to the ground.
Hi, my name is Diego. Mr. Henry, you've been called the voice of revolutions. Please tell us about March 23rd, 1775, when you addressed the Second Virginia Convention at the Henrico Parish Church in Richmond.
Thank you, Diego, for remembering that particular date. The occasion was the Second Virginia Convention. Do you remember, we were just speaking of Lord Dunmore dissolving the House of Burgesses. We never met again, really, as a colonial legislature, as Burgesses, but we did meet in a series of conventions, and that one in Richmond was the second such convention. I already knew, based upon the previous 10 years of British rule, misrule, that war with our mother country was inevitable. It was coming. The greatest number of Americans at the time believed that it would not, that, oh, His Majesty will wake up from being misguided as he is by these corrupt ministers in Parliament. Well, I realized too, and I pointed out that day, that when that invasion did come of British redcoats and Marines, or lobsterbacks, that we did not have a means of defending ourselves. And therefore, I introduced a resolution calling for Virginia to place herself into a posture of defense, that all able-bodied males between the ages of 16 and 60 be armed and ready to march at a moment's notice to the defense of Virginia. Well, there were naturally those cool conservative men, those submissionists, I would call them, who spoke out against my resolution. They believed that if we passed that resolution of mine, that the British government was going to view that as a hostile or aggressive action, and that alone would bring this invasion. Otherwise, the invasion would not come. But they were very eloquent men such as Pendleton, you recall?
Oh, yes, and Robert Carter Nicholas.
Why, indeed, sir, your mentor, Mr. Wythe, to large measure, yes, too. Colonel Bland, all of these very highly respected men and very eloquent. And as I looked about the town church, For we were meeting in the church in Richmond. It was the only building in that small village which was big enough to accommodate all 120 men who were part of that convention. But I looked around and I realized that they had probably persuaded the majority of men to vote against my resolution, thus continuing us in this defenseless state. Well, I had to do something. And so I asked to be recognized, took to the floor, and delivered forth a great many more words than many might realize, for Mr. Jefferson will tell you that I'm not brief any time at all, but it ended with one particular statement, which I'm pleased to see has spread like a wildfire throughout the rest of these American states, having to do with liberty or death. Happily, I was able to convince a majority of men to vote in favor of my resolution. Virginia became ready, and as I predicted, the invasion came a month later. In fact, it was about a month later that blood was spilled at Lexington Green in Massachusetts Bay, in that civil war with our mother country, which we had long sought to prevent, began in earnest. No turning back then. Mr. Jefferson was present, too, as I recall. Were you not,
Oh,
sir?
I was present, yes. I was there in St. John's Church in Richmond, and I remember distinctly your speech, sir. You started out very calmly, very reasoned, and we listened to your reasoned argument, and then as you drew us further and further into your astounding oration, your choice of words, your vivid imagery of what we were suffering, well, sir, you then brought your speech to a greater height of volume, greater intensity. And when you clasped your hands together like this and said,
"Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here, idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death."
Hi, my name is Alex. Mr. Jefferson, did you support Mr. Henry's motion to form a militia?
I can tell you, Alex, I certainly did. I felt it was time now that we cross the Rubicon. We could no longer suffer these instances whereby we were prohibited to protect and defend ourselves, not only in person and property, but protect and defend our rights. So yes, I had already served on committees of correspondence, and it was time now that committees of defense begin to become active. So without a question, I certainly did support Mr. Henry's formation of a militia and the formation of other militias, and to begin to come together with what eventually was the American armies. And the appointment, of course, of our compatriot, our friend, Colonel George Washington, as general of those American armies.
Hello, my name is Ashley. Mr. Henry, you were voted leader of a militia unit. Tell us about your leadership skills and your march to the defense of the Capitol at Williamsburg. What other military experiences did you have?
You know, in truth, I didn't have a great deal of military experience when I was elected to serve as the commanding officer of the Hanover County Independent Company. Oh, sure, I served in my county militia. In Virginia, that's the law. Once you turn 18, provided that you're of able body, you serve in your militia. So I knew something about the dealings of an armed force, but never actually led a unit before. My father was the commanding officer of the Hanover County Militia, so I had some knowledge and understanding of it there. He always encouraged me, for example, to read of the military exploits of such men as the Duke of Marlborough and Alexander the Great and such like. So I was not completely a novice. But the first armed expedition against the Crown in Virginia was under my command. We'd heard that Dunmore had stolen the gunpowder from the Public magazine in Williamsburg, and I was determined to march to the front door of the governor's palace if need be, but to take back that powder, or to at least receive payment for it. It never came to violence because 16 miles to the north and west of Williamsburg at Mr. Duncastle's ordinary. Finally, payment was made in the amount of £330 in a treasury bill. Satisfied with that, I then went back to Philadelphia to serve at the second session of the Congress. Well, while I was away, here there was a third convention that met in Richmond once again. And in the course of that assembly, I was elected, though not even present, Commander-in-Chief of the Virginia Army, a standing army, despite my relative lack of military experience. I believe that history will regard my command very well indeed, though it was rather short-lived, for in February of 1776 I resigned my commission that I might then take a seat once again in Virginia politics.
Hi, my name is Jacinia. Mr. Jefferson, what was your military experience?
Well, Jacinia, as you heard Mr. Henry say, it was an obligation of a young man whose family was seated in any community or vicinage to serve in the county militia. Now, of course, the militias had to first be appointed by the government, otherwise they would be illegal. So any militia had to be a legal militia recognized by the royal authority. So I served accordingly and was even commissioned a lieutenant in the Albemarle militia, and I suppose was worthy enough to be considered to be commissioned as colonel, and that was bestowed on me as our revolution began. So I was actually a colonel of Virginia militia, the militia in Albemarle County. Oh, I even purchased a very fine sword that was indicative of my rank. I still have it. So though not experienced, I would say, as Mr. Henry became, for you've just heard that he was recognized as commander of all Virginia militias, I still was rather proud of my rank and have been referred to by some as Colonel Jefferson.
Hi, my name is Kaylina. Mr. Jefferson, on August 23, 1775, King George III declared America in a state of open and avowed rebellion. What did this mean for the colonies?
Well, it meant that we were officially at war. Remember, we retaliated when we learned that the British forces were ordered to deprive us of our arms and our munitions. The first public recognition of the attack in Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, and but several days later in Williamsburg, Royal Governor Dunmore sought to remove our munitions and our arms from the magazine, the magazine arsenal there in Williamsburg. So our retaliations already brought us into a system of defense. Mr. Henry, as you heard earlier, helping to form militia. And by 75, Mr. Henry, of course, commissioned the commander of Virginia militia. So we were already at war. So this was an official declaration of Great Britain that an official war is now being engaged by colonies in rebellion. And as you know, within but, 8-10 months, in the spring of 1776, Virginia became the first of all of the colonies to officially declare their independency. That was May the 15th, 1776. Mr. Henry, you were there in Williamsburg in the House of Burgesses when that was proclaimed.
Indeed I was. You know, when a man becomes King of England, he swears an oath to God. That oath being that he will protect his people and he will defend the faith. When King George proclaimed that those colonies are an open and avowed rebellion, he also said, and out of my protection, he severed that bond between we, his dutiful subjects, and the empire of Great Britain. As Mr. Jefferson stated, though we'd been fighting for some time already, the war was official when he made that statement. And I would also say to you that when he made that statement, he broke his oath to God.
Hello, my name is Ariana. Mr. Henry and Mr. Jefferson, will you each outline your reasons for declaring independence from Great Britain?
I would say that to outline the particular reasons that I feel were necessary necessary to seek independence from Great Britain would mean to merely say, read our Declaration of American Independence. It is all right there. You cannot cite but a few reasons because there were so many, and all of these reasons were being purported and talked about and printed in the newspapers and argued and debated in representative legislators in each and every one of the colonies. And that is why in Philadelphia, all of the grievances were brought together. And when I was asked to take up the pen and draft a Declaration of Independence, why we are seceding from England, I had to include in that declaration all of these grievances. All that we had agreed upon are the reasons that we are now seeking independence. Now, the essence of it is, of course, that as Mr. Henry said, the king had a compact and a contract with the people to protect and defend them. He had broken that contract. And so therefore, in breaking the contract, becoming more tyrannical in imposing upon the liberties and the rights of the people, denying them the opportunity to gather together in the liberty of assembly, closing down their printing presses, closing down their courts of law, dissolving the representative bodies, the assemblies and the House of Burgesses themselves. All of this is a neglect of the rights of the people to be represented, and particularly for their representatives to be free in governing them. So our Declaration of Independence is perfectly worded, if you will, and I take rather an honor in recognizing that, perfectly worded to show the reasons why any people anywhere have a right to alter or dissolve their government and install a new one that better serves their safety and happiness.
On this point, I will absolutely agree with my worthy friend that of the rather few accomplishments that Mr. Jefferson has made in all of his life, the Declaration of Independence was certainly the highest amongst them. A very beautiful and eloquent document. And if one wishes to understand all of the many reasons that we had to declare independence, it's in that paper.
Hi, my name is Hannah. Gentlemen, you're both Virginians. What was the war on the Virginia front like in the early years?
Well, I was serving as the governor of Virginia in the early years. Remember, war broke out actually in April of 1775, but it was all being fought north or south of Virginia. We did not feel the full fury of war in Virginia during my whole term, 3 terms, as governor. Unfortunately, the full fury of war did come to Virginia when my worthy friend, Mr. Jefferson, took over the mantle of the governorship.
Yes, I was the second elected governor of our new Commonwealth of Virginia, though I dare say, Mr. Henry, I will never forget, I was not your first choice to succeed you. I did my best to protect and defend our Commonwealth, and particularly to protect and defend the new capital of Virginia. I was responsible for moving the capital of politics from Williamsburg, where it had been installed for a good 80 years, that it might be better protected and defended on the heights of Richmond. But during the time that I was governor and we had moved to Richmond, we were attacked and invaded by the British. Firstly, by General Benedict Arnold, the turncoat.
May his name ever live in infamy.
War, and later, of course, by General Charles Lord Cornwallis. And therefore I found it necessary as governor to order a retreat, that we must seek our safety and preserve, protect, and defend the government of the Commonwealth of Virginia. By that time, Virginia, indeed, was the very center of our American Revolutionary War.
My name is Ryan. Mr. Henry, you were Virginia's governor during the Revolutionary period, serving your 3 one-year terms. What were your duties, responsibilities, accomplishments, and challenges?
In our Virginia Constitution, we made it very clear that the powers of the governor were going to be very limited, and furthermore, we determined that there would be term limits. No more than 3 consecutive one-year terms, at which time a man must stand down to private station for at least 4 years before he might hold the office of governor again. I flatter myself that I conducted myself most admirably as a governor, with my first and principal responsibility being keeping you safe. This I did. I erected a navy, admittedly not a very large navy, only 9 ships during my time, and not nearly so well armed as were British ships of the line, but it was a beginning. I also had a most productive meeting with a young man by the name of Clark, George Rogers Clark, who agreed to protect our back door, the Cumberland Gap. For you know, we're not only fighting against British redcoats, we're also fighting some Indians out west. And he protected that part of the frontier that was so critical at that time. I again feel proud of my chief actions of keeping the people of Virginia safe during my time as governor.
Hi, my name is Abby. Mr. Jefferson, you served as Virginia's governor following Mr. Henry. What challenges did you encounter as the war for independence was still being fought?
Well, Miss Abby, as I already said, the great challenge, of course, was the protection, safety, and defense of our Commonwealth of Virginia during a time of invasion, beginning that winter of 1780. And so therefore I found it, well, rather difficult, if you will, particularly to defend the Capitol in Richmond, simply because our Virginia militias were not all together in one place to protect and defend us. In fact, as I have written, they appeared and disappeared with the seasons and the crops, meaning simply that they would go back to their farms and continue the cultivation of their plantations rather than serve to protect and defend our Commonwealth. Oh, when they had attended to their harvest, well, then perhaps it would be time to return to our defense. As a consequence, I felt it necessary that we retreat from Richmond to be better defended, perhaps in Charlottesville. And that is where the government moved at that time in the spring of 1780. And then, if you will, excuse me, it was 81 at that time, I beg your pardon, 81. And then at that time to realize that perhaps I was not the best chief executive to be Certainly Mr. Henry felt I was not the best chief executive.
I'm finding it very difficult, my friends, to keep my tongue at this present time. Mr. Jefferson is blaming everyone but himself for the troubles that we faced in 1780 and 81.
Mr. Henry,
you
heard
had
me
ample
distinctly
warning by the
say
council.
that I myself did not feel I was the best equipped to serve as our chief magistrate.
Indeed.
That perhaps someone of better and more extensive military experience might best serve our Commonwealth.
My worthy friend I have known since he was 17 years of age. And he is a man of many talents, many gifts, truly. Perhaps his extraordinary gift of the written word being chiefest amongst them. But I knew that his abilities to manage a government was not nearly so well tuned as Mr. John Page. I believed that Mr. John Page would have been most well suited to be my successor. He was, after all, my lieutenant governor. He'd already held the reins of government in my absence, owing to illness. But nonetheless, the legislature finally, after 32 ballots, I think, they finally allowed Mr. Jefferson to be the governor. I knew it was going to be catastrophic, and it was. Mr. Jefferson makes no truth of the statement that he did not have adequate warning that the British were coming to Virginia. He knew it. 2 of my brothers-in-law serve upon the War Council. They warned him. They also told him what he should do to prevent the capital of Richmond from falling.
Regardless of your brothers, may I say, Mr. Henry, I was warned indeed by James Monroe and the Marquis de Lafayette. And yet what forces did we have to greet the enemy?
You could have raised those forces, Mr. Jefferson. That's the point.
I could have raised the forces in Virginia, when the majority of Virginia forces, if they were not on their farms and plantations, were in South Carolina, southwards there. How was there any force to be raised to greet the enemy? And where were you, Mr. Henry? At the time you were in our legislature, and I recall you, sir, were on the very same retreat.
Indeed, I was
retreating to Charlottesville itself. Oh, Mr. Henry, your accusations will continue. I assure you they continue to be my great bane. As I have forgotten that the invasions occurred in the spring of 81, sir, I wish I could forget these accusations that you apparently continue to hurl against me.
Hi, my name is Titus. Gentlemen, the war took many twists and turns. Did you ever doubt that the colonies would win the struggle for independence?
Well, Titus, I may answer to you. To doubt whether your efforts will be successful is only human. But you must always seek to overcome that doubt, always seek to have a greater hope than you would ever suffer yourself with doubt. Of course, even when I took up the pen to draft our Declaration of American Independence, I realized that I could very well be writing our death certificate. And as all the signers affixed their names then, they realized as well they could be signing their death certificate. We were taking a great risk. Imagine 13 individual nations coming together but without any organization as far as armies were concerned beforehand. Here we were all coming together for the very first time, moving forward through uncharted waters. Man had never been here before, and contesting with one of the greatest, many say the British Army, the British Navy, the greatest forces of war upon this globe. So I must readily admit, yes, there was doubt, but we had to overcome that with hope.
There were certainly some very dark moments, but as for me, I placed my trust in God. I stated, in fact, as early as 1775, even before hostilities had actually erupted, that he was the same God, unchanged and unchangeable, friend to the oppressed, enemy to the oppressor. I was confident that though the war would last a long time, God Almighty was on our side, and we would win.
Hello, my name is Brigitte. Having secured the victory, what issues and concerns needed to be addressed in order to maintain a free nation?
As for me, in Williamsburg City, which was still capital of Virginia at the time, we established a bold new experiment, a new nation, a republic. And the first thing that we did, even before we established our Constitution, was we wrote a Bill of Rights, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which meant that for the first time ever in your lives or in the histories of your families, that you were no longer beholden to your government, instead that your government was beholden to you. In other words, you were no longer subjects, but rather citizens. And therein lies the greatest concern that I have about the future of our country. Because unless we have a citizenry who is committed to always being suspicious and watchful of government, then this bold experiment might not meet such a great end. Mr. Jefferson and I, one day, and it was General Washington that said this to me first, but he said, one day, Mr. Henry, you and I will be too old or too weary or dead and will no longer be able to guide this bright and prosperous country into a bright and prosperous future. Upon whom do you suppose that's going to fall, that responsibility? You. So it is my hope that, and I'm very happy to see that there's great promise here before us, Mr. Jefferson.
Well, I am as well, Mr. Henry.
But that you will always be an active and informed citizenry.
I share with Mr. Henry a concern and a caution about our government. We should always inspect our government to make certain that they are fulfilling their obligation unto us, that they continually remind ourselves that they are seated because of the people, that the people allow their government to be seated. However, we must also remind ourselves that the purpose of government, and the only purpose of government, is to protect us from injury by one another. Otherwise, leave us free to pursue our own industry and our own improvement. So I hope, Mr. Henry, we never forget that the purpose of government is to protect and defend each and every American citizen.
Hi, my name is Caitlin. Gentlemen, what do you see as the future of these 13 United States of America?
It is my hope that these 13 independent states will continue to trade as friends, but I assure you, I will not give my support ever to a plan calling for a national, so-called federal government. It is doomed to failure in my humble view. Let us trade freely. Let us recognize each other's money. Let us navigate rivers happily. Let us find some peaceable means of resolving disputes that we have regarding borders or boundaries. For all these reasons, I would wish that we continue with a loose alliance, a confederacy, but no national government.
I'm afraid Mr. Henry and myself are divided upon this point. I believe that a federal government is necessary. I am cautious, Mr. Henry, I'm cautious as you are, that we should never allow our federal government to grow too very large. After all, the only purpose of a federal government is to provide for the general safety, the general defense, and the general system of taxation relative to the safety and defense of our nation. Otherwise, indeed, I am cautious that we might build a business out of our government, which cannot help but to incur further taxes in order to support it. These are essential principles over which we fought our American Revolution. They are the principles of our compact, our contract. Remember, we brought 13 individual nations together. How do we hold that nation together? Through a federal system, particularly to protect and defend each and every one of these nations, that is, our states and commonwealths, from insurrections within themselves. That would be an act of aggression and hostility and attack upon other people who have just a right to be peaceable and attend to their business, as others who feel it may be their right to intrude and impose upon their fellow citizen. So the compact, in my opinion, must be maintained, and that can only be maintained, protected, and defended by a federal government. You ask my hope for the future, and that is that we continue to be a well-informed citizenry, that we might have systems of education that will provide an education to the poor as well as the wealthy, the female as well as the male. And yet, Mr. Henry, I'm sorry to say, many Americans feel it is not their obligation to take from their pocket and pay for the education of their fellow citizens. How are we going to uphold the principles of our American Revolution unless we have an educated citizenry? So in that regard, dear, my greatest hope for the future is a well-educated citizenry. My greatest fear, ignorance.
Hello, my name is Alex. My fellow students and I would like to thank you for talking with us today. It has been a most interesting conversation, and we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Miss Alice, may I thank you and all of your classmates for making your way here, that you could be in our company. I can assure you it is my honor, and I know it is Mr. Henry's honor, and thereby to assure you that our outbursts must not be taken so much to heart that you would forget that Mr. Henry and I do remain compatriots, that we do remain fellow Americans, and that we know as Americans we can agree to disagree, but the more so, do we not understand, Mr. Henry, that as Americans, a difference of opinion need not be a difference of principle?
Hear, hear, sir. On that point, I'm forever agreed.
I thank you, sir.
On behalf of Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest, thank you for participating in our educational program with Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and students from Brookneal Elementary School. Students and teachers may email additional questions to Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, or the Poplar Forest online historian at education@poplarforest.org. Lesson plans and supporting materials for teachers can be found at www.poplarforest.org/Henry.